Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream for Hitchback Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joanna Kujawa, and today we're going to be discussing the Gospel of Mary. Well, welcome back to the show, Dr. Kujawa. It's been some time.
Hi, Jacob. It's good to see you again. It's our third time
Yep,
yeah,
it
on
is.
the show.
Yep,
Thank you for inviting me again.
of course. So today we're talking about the Gospel of Mary.
Mhm.
So what do we know about the Gospel of Mary? Does it tell us anything reliable at all about Mary Magdalene? Or only parts of it reliable and the rest of it not so much?
Mhm. Before I actually, that's an excellent question, Jacob. Thank you. But before I launch into this, perhaps I want to put it in a particular, context because, it actually indirectly addresses your question. So, when I started to look into the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it was when I was writing, the other goddess. And there, I didn't focus really on the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. I was just kind of exploring alternative and esoteric traditions about Mary Magdalene. And I made some connections between her and, the ancient goddesses of Sumer, such as Ninma and then Inanna and Isis. And I noticed, and also some Hindu esoteric goddesses of Tantra, such as Kali and Sundari. And I noticed that all of these goddesses had two elements, apart from three elements actually, that they were conveying a secret knowledge to humanity. That was one. There was some erotic elements to all of them, like in Mary Magdalene. I know even in popular imagination, sometimes she's still seen as a prostitute, although we know it's not true. And the third one was that they were somehow associated with the process of resurrection, which, nowadays we would rather call it, and it's just also very popular, the process of ascension, or perhaps the process of enlightenment when we are still alive and transcending the boundaries between death and life. I also made a connection between Mary Magdalene and Mary the Jewess, which was also called the Mary the Alchemist or Mary the Prophetess, because Mary the Prophetess was an alchemist, and she specialized in spiritual alchemy because there are two types of alchemy. One is, the physical one or chemical one, turning, base metals into gold, and the other one is spiritual one, which is basically, again, the process of ascension. And Mary the Jewess or Mary the Alchemist lived in first century Alexandria, and we have evidence for this, which can be checked in the National Library of Israel and so on. So we know she existed, and and I made a connection. It was a long story between Vita Contemplativa by Philo of Alexandria and the movement of Therapete, which were the healers who admitted women, and philosophers and healers who admitted women in the circus, and they lived in the, around the Alexandria, first century Alexandria, and also the fact that Zosimus, a famous third century um, alchemist, was mentioning Mary the Prophetess as, who was partially, at least partially Jewish, and that's why she could convey the knowledge of ancient Egypt, which, naturally born Egyptians were not allowed to do. So this is what I explore in the other goddess. And then I said, oh, by the way, there's a Gnostic version of Mary Magdalene. And I very briefly described, the Gnostics and the gospel. But now, when I do my research, possibly for the next book, that I also would like to share with your audience, is, focusing more on the Egyptian connection with of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So basically, to answer your question, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is really not about Mary Magdalene as much, but about a particular teachings, that Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Mary conveys to the other disciples, which she says Jesus gave her in a vision. So it is a long answer to your question, but the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is less about Mary Magdalene, but the teachings of ascension, and basically how can we expand consciousness. She teaches 4 levels of consciousness, and what I wanted to focus on in our conversation today is, how it relates actually to some other esoteric teachings of Egypt, and then move on, what actually the Gospel of Mary Magdalene says. Does it make any sense? Does it make sense? It's less about who Mary Magdalene was, more about what I guess some Gnostic circles in Egypt, especially because the Gospel of Mary was discovered in Egypt, and I'm going to discuss it in a moment, would consider esoteric teachings of Jesus. But of course, when we look at esoterica, we don't know if they're true teachings or not, right? Like we don't know what true teachings even in the Bible or the Gospels, right? They're just canonical teachings. Canonical means that they conform to the rule, basically to the Roman rule. So Gnostics would argue that other writings that were not included in the canonical Gospels are the ones that simply didn't comply with the rule. And that's why I think we love Gnostics, right? Because they did not comply. But this is just one form of belief, and this is just one form of being, following the teachings. So, okay, so maybe I'll just discuss, what happened, how the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was found, right? So originally it was found for the first time, as far as we know, in 1896, and it was in Akhmin, which is quite interesting because before, when I was introducing Mary Magdalene with the other goddess, the philosopher, the alchemist Zosimus, was actually from Akhmin, and he mentions, Mary the Jurist. So I think there's already some tradition of Mary Magdalene there. So it was found in Akhmin, and it was really not looked into until 1950s. And some German scholars started to look into it, and it is called the Berlin Papyrus, or the Berlin Codex. And it was dated quite late, into early 400s. However, a couple of years later, in another city up, the Nile, a little bit to the north, and on the other side of Nile, called Oxyrhynchus, there was another fragment of the Gospel of Mary was found, and it was an earlier fragment. The first fragment was in Coptic, by the way, and the one then from Oxyrhynchus, which is called the Ryland Codex, was dated into 200s, and it was in Greek, and scholarly analysis of a text presumed that it must be there must have been an earlier text than that, simply because of some linguistic borrowings from a Coptic text that they think was even earlier, but of which we don't know, and some of them weren't as brave as, just to say that maybe it even 95, would be the dating of the Gospel. So I think it is really important to remember, where the Gospel of Mary was found, simply because, it was found in Egypt. So it was probably, embedding some already inherent teachings, of Egyptian esoterica, right? So I think that we cannot really read the Gospel of Mary, as it is, because first of all, it is very complex and very esoteric, like lots of this kind of texts are. Similar, like when I was reading tantric texts, were also extremely esoteric and difficult to read, and it is very difficult to read it without the context of the place in which it was found, right? So that's why I think it is really important to look into the Egyptian kind of sources for the Gospel of Mary.
And how does it tie into the Egyptian esoterics that you mentioned earlier?
Mm-hmm. So I'll go deeper into this when I discuss, different levels of consciousness and the levels of ascension that, she, or, the Gospels in her name, the person who wrote it, teaches. But basically, there are some similarities, for example, between Egyptian Gnostics and the Egyptian esoterica. So, for example, Egyptian Gnostics believed that Jesus gave 3 levels of teachings. One was, for the people living around the Sea of Galilee, which were, farmers and fishermen. So it had to be more basic, right? Because they were uneducated people. Then that he gave a second level of teachings to his disciples, and he gave a third level of teachings to his most advanced disciples. And in some sources they claim that Mary Magdalene was, the more advanced disciples. So there are this kind of concept of 3 levels of teachings. And for example, in Egyptian esoterica, there is a belief that hieroglyphics actually have also, and everything written in hieroglyphics has actually 3 levels. One is, for the crowds, as they say, so for everybody. The second level is for the priests, who understand the rituals and know how to convey the rituals, but they do not understand necessarily the meaning of the rituals. And the third one is for the hierophants. And hierophants were the ones who were taking the initiates into, the inner sanctum, so to speak, and to the experience of ascension, or maybe what in Eastern term would be called enlightenment. Right? So, for example, there are 3 levels of understanding that kind of overlap between Egyptian Gnostics and the understanding what hieroglyphics are. And also the Egyptian esoterica is steeped in the myth of Isis and Osiris, right? So normally we know the myth of Isis and Osiris. Osiris was killed by his evil brother Seth, right? Then Isis finds 14 or 42 pieces of Osiris, which is, depends on who tells the story, and then also manages to find his phallus, and, manages to conceive Horus. So this is the story from a mythological point of view. But in Egyptian esoterica, the story is understood differently, and it is also often represented in the different temples of, Egypt, but especially, for example, in the temples of Karnak, where the figure of Isis, of Aminet, is very strong. And then this is how this myth is understood in the terms of Egyptian esoterica. So, for example, Osiris represents us, so humanity, but not entirely the whole of humanity, but rather the aspirants or the initiates, those who are ready to get initiated, right? So Osiris is like one of us who wants to be initiated. Then Horus, the child of Isis and Osiris, is not understood as a child, but as resurrected Osiris, or resurrected human consciousness on a much higher level. So that's why very often Horus is represented with a serpent, cobra actually, above his head, representing a higher level of consciousness. So he's the example of resurrected consciousness, so to speak, or the resurrected being, or the perfected being, like the anthropos, for example, right, in Greek terms. And then Isis in Egyptian esoterica is seen as the hierophant. There's some discussion here whether she's actually anyway, let's stick to the most basic representation. So Isis is the hierophant because she actually conducted the ritual of resurrection, but in esoteric terms, it's really resurrection of consciousness, or resurrection of enlightenment, or basically an ascension of human consciousness. So Horus in this interpretation is basically resurrected Osiris, or resurrected initiate, who is now in the known, who bypassed, the portals of death and life, or, interdimensional portals, or however the esoteric teachings understood it. And also, just maybe as a curiosity, because I am, although I look at it scholarly, I also am primarily call myself spiritual detective because I consider myself a spiritual seeker. And then I think, are these teachings valid for us, right? So also academically, I wrote about Paul Branton, who was writing about, Hindu and also Egyptian esoterica. And one of his books, famous books, he wrote about, his experience in the Pyramid of Giza, because those associated with the Egyptian esoterica believe that the Pyramid of Giza, especially the Great Pyramid, was used for this purpose of initiation. And that's why there is this, sarcophagus there that it is believed was used for the initiation of the initiate, simply because, it was not believed that it was a burial thing, because in burial things you have inscriptions, describing who died and why and so on, and there are no inscriptions on the sarcophagus at all. And in fact, it was a place where the initiation was started by the Hierophants. And then Paul Branton himself in early 1930s, shut himself down in the Pyramid of Giza for a night. He paid people, so he would be allowed to do this. And he describes his own experience. So if people are interested in this, I highly recommend his book, because he's talking about his experience of how he went actually through the initiation, and whether your listeners want to believe or not, he believes that the process of initiation actually started, and he met some disembodied beings and so on. And then recently I had an interview on Lazarus Initiative, and the host told me that he tried to repeat the same experience in 1999 in Egypt, and that weird things happen, and he didn't go through all of the initiation because he was basically completely freaked out. Strange stuff was going on, but basically it is believed that the Great Pyramid of Giza was used for the process of initiation into higher levels of consciousness in Egyptian esoterica.
Does the Gospel of Mary preserve even the slightest teaching of Mary Magdalene, or is it really just not really about Mary Magdalene at all, despite the name?
Yeah, it is actually to a degree it is about Mary Magdalene, but as I said, it is mostly about teachings, because especially that's why I started this conversation a little bit differently, because in my book I make a connection between Mary Magdalene and Isis and so on, but they represent the same archetypical female that is somehow essential, both erotic and essential in the process of resurrection. And the Egyptian, so to speak, myth is very similar, or even earlier myth, Assyrian myth of Inanna, which is also associated with resurrection and Eros, is very similar to what, the story of Mary Magdalene and Jesus is. So in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and I'll get into this in detail, but in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, she is the one, so she gives the kind of Gnostic version of Mary Magdalene, right? Because she is the one that conveys the teachings to the other disciples. So maybe I just should mention that we have only fragments of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So for example, pages 1 to 6 are missing, right? And we start with page 7, and this is where Peter asks question to Jesus and says, and basically asks, "Teacher, please tell us about the sin of the world." And Jesus gives this surprising answer from, because I was brought up as a Catholic, right? So he gives this surprising and wonderful, in my opinion, answer, because he says the sin of the world as such does not exist. And he then continues to explain that, for example, sin is basically a consequence of our own actions, which come from a lower level of consciousness, which is very much in touch with the rest of Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which I'll discuss. So if we do something from a lower level of consciousness, so let's say greed, insecurity, or fear, or some kind of inappropriate desire, it will have negative consequences. But in itself, sin as such does not exist. So the first part is basically starts with the question from Peter to Jesus. And then on page 7, I think it's on page 8, Jesus also says, look into yourself. Do not listen to other people, right? Because he says they will try to mislead you. They said, look, truth is there, the truth is out there, or the truth is here, but it's not. You have to look within. So this is the first part of Gospel of Mary Magdalene that, in a way, has very little to do with her. And because not only in the second part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene really shows up. I think I'm just checking my notes, on page 10. And this is where the disciples, obviously the death already or the resurrection happened, the crucifixion happened, and the disciples are all distraught and crying. And Mary Magdalene gathers them around and she says, brothers, let's not despair and just, let's honor our teacher. And then she's being asked the question, and I think it is again by Peter, who says, sister, we know that the teacher loved you more than us. Share the teachings that he shared with you and he did not share with us. And this is when Mary Magdalene starts to give the teachings of ascension. So Mary Magdalene is actually not prominent in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene until the second part, which is, I think it is page 10 of the Gospel. Mind you, there are like several pages missing, even page 1 to 6 is missing as well, right? So it starts with the questions that Peter asks about, should we have more laws to follow? And Jesus says, we don't need more laws to bind us, right? Otherwise, we have no, we have no freedom. Sin is just a consequence of our actions from the lower level of consciousness, which we explore in the second part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And the third one, what was the third one? Okay, be vigilant. Do not trust others when they tell you the truth is out there, because the truth is within, right? And only on page 10, Mary Magdalene shows up when they're already distressed, and they ask her basically for emotional support and also to share the teachings that Jesus shared with her that he didn't share with them. So this in itself is very radical, because there is an assumption there in the question already on page 10, that he shared some teachings with her that he didn't share with anyone else. So in a way, it is about Mary Magdalene implicitly, because it assumes, that she was given access to esoteric teachings of Jesus, when for example, Peter was not. Which is quite interesting, if you were brought up a Christian or Catholic, especially like me, when, Peter is supposed to be, the founder of a church and so on. And in fact, in the Gospel of Mary, he's the one who is actually knows the list. And, the one who is really very bad-tempered and understands nothing from the teachings, esoteric teachings of Jesus. So in this way, it is very radical. And it does tell us something about Mary Magdalene, because here she is, she's teaching the other disciples about things that Jesus didn't share with others, because he didn't find them, I don't know, perhaps spiritually advanced enough or worthy.
So is that like different levels of the messianic secret? Like, okay, so I'm going to, like in the Gospel of Mark, and scholars talk about this, like in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus doesn't want people to understand what he's saying. And so to a degree, does he also not want his disciples and apostles to understand certain other things that he thinks is too sensitive to share with them too?
That's a very interesting question, and I never thought about it this way. So I didn't think that, he didn't want to share because it is too sensitive. And personally, I never really looked at Jesus, so that may be the difference, right, between canonical and Gnostic understanding of Jesus, as a Messiah. I always look at him as what in the East would be called a great teacher, right? Or even like in Hinduism, you have great teachers, so you have avatars, somebody who embodies, or bodhisattvas in Buddhism, to convey certain teachings. So I don't think he wanted to hide teachings because they were too sensitive, because it sounds more like a political version of Jesus, which is valid, but I do not explore this one. But rather that I think he didn't share his teachings because perhaps he didn't think they were ready, to receive them. Right, so that they were not ready to receive them, and by ready I mean probably spiritually ready, or intellectually ready to receive them. So this kind of conveys a special place of Mary Magdalene in this setting. So indirectly it says something about her, right? But less so that I think he didn't want to share, but rather that maybe he didn't consider them, that they would be able to understand, or if he shared them, they still didn't understand it. Because, for example, when Mary Magdalene shares the teachings that he had shared with her, and she explains them to them, most of them still do not understand it. Peter still don't understand it. Andrew still don't understand it, right? They just get angry, and both the two disciples, Peter and Andrew, get really angry because she explained the teachings to them and they still don't get it. So I think that perhaps it was the same was true with Jesus, that he was saying what, and teaching what he knew, but some of them just didn't get it, rather than trying to hide something. Because I do not believe that I see Jesus maybe not as a Messiah or the Son of God, but as a great teacher. So I don't think that great teacher would just hide teachings. And if they hide, it is because they do believe that the particular disciple at this particular time and place is not ready to receive them yet. And when they are received, they offer the teachings freely. But this is my interpretation, which is, colored by my study of Gnosticism and my study of esoteric Tantra and esoteric Buddhism, but mostly esoteric Tantra.
Do we know anything about who wrote this text and when it was written as well?
Okay, so what we know about this text, it is when I was explaining when it was found, the earliest version that we have is from 200s, early 200s. So this is the Greek version from Oxyrhynchus on the Nile, which is North Egypt. And there is a scholarly discussion about it because some scholars believe that this particular codex, this particular papyrus, which is in Greek, actually must have had an earlier Coptic version because of some linguistic borrowings, and some of them say that it could have been as early as 90 or 95 AD, which makes it almost parallel with the canonical Gospels. But it's an open question because the fragment from Oxyrhynchus is dated for early 200s. So this is what we have. By then it existed, and then there's a assumption because of linguistic studies that there is even an earlier version in Coptic.
So it's believed that the original version of the text probably dated to the 90s.
Yeah, as early as the 90s, yeah. And some serious scholars think so. So, but the material copy, right, is from early 200s, which is from Oxyrhynchus. And if we have to, as I mentioned before, the Gospel of Mary is really truncated. It just, many pages are missing and they're just trying to put it together. But some people believe that it's as early as 1995, yes, which is basically parallel with what is called the canonical Gospels. Or at least the later versions of them, like Gospel of John and so on, right?
Does it primarily borrow from Egyptian esoterics, or does it also at times key off of other religions, Greco-Roman material, or maybe even later translations of Mesopotamian material?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you for this. So, I in what I'm researching right now, and I'm in the process of researching, I focus on the esoteric Egypt at the moment, but there is a very strong overlap also with some Neoplatonic teachings as well, So, for example, or should I say Platonic teachings that were, present then in Egypt as well, but they're connected to Egypt. At that time as well. So, for example, when we move to the explanation of the 4 levels of consciousness and the ascension of the soul through the 4 levels of 4 levels of consciousness, that the soul has to ascend to drop the body and also to reach ascension or enlightenment. They are somewhat parallel what, for example, educated Platonists, at the time would know, except that the Platonic version was more about 3 levels, when this one has an additional level in the middle, which is called nous. And this particular level that is called nous is, now heavily explored by scholars and what it really means and so on, right? And I have my own explanation, and I can also say what others are saying. But yes, there's definitely borrowing from, Platonic teachings as well, and some versions of it. But as it was seen and preserved in Egypt at the time. So I think that we cannot really read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene without considering its Egyptian origins.
Do you believe that the majority or all or only parts of the material in the Gospel of Mary were actually like the things that it alleges that Jesus said. Does a lot of it go back to him or not much of it?
Well, it's difficult to know. Do we know whether Jesus really said what he said in the canonical gospel? That's a gospels. It is a good question, right? By itself. So here, I do believe so personally, and that's why, because as I said, although I have a scholarly look at it, I'm also a spiritual seeker. So I personally would not read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene if it was just of a scholarly interest to me. I just want to know, can I learn something from this, right? So for me personally, but this is just a personal opinion here, not a scholarly opinion, is that this Gospel of Mary Magdalene, like some other Gnostic Gospels, maybe like Gospel of Thomas or even Gospel of Philip, which are my favorite Gnostic Gospels apart from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, that is actually giving a truer version of Jesus for me. But it also depends, how you see Jesus. For some people, he's an apocalyptic teacher, as you know, right? You interview scholars, on this issue. For some people, and especially even for, canonical Bible, he's a very much a messianic teacher and so on. And I don't look at him at this way. I think that this kind of assumption that he was an apocalyptic teacher or that he was a Messiah actually take away from his teachings. Because why don't we focus on what the Gospels, for example, in this case, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because we're looking at it, is actually saying that he said, rather than trying to bait it against other Gospels, which were also heavily edited, which are called canonical Gospels, which means basically they conform to what the Roman Empire were able to accept from the teachings, and which are, in my opinion, much less radical, right? Because they make us dependent on the person. And I'm just expressing my own spiritual inclinations and how I read the text now. Okay, so because I don't want to insult anybody's beliefs, rather than making us dependent on some kind of a messianic figure that comes and saves us. And although I was brought up as a Catholic, I completely moved away from this version of belief in Jesus. I treat him as a spiritual teacher of great insight. And, perhaps even like in Hindu terms, because I studied heavily Hindu esoterica as well, avatar, which means like a bodhisattva in Buddhism, which means a teacher who maybe embodied comes back to, to teach us something. And then they teach us spiritual truths that liberate us. So it means we are responsible for our own liberation, so to speak. We are responsible for the evolution of our own consciousness. And the Gospel of Mary Magdalene kind of describes in a very convoluted and enigmatic way, mind you, if you don't look at the Egyptian sources and if you don't look at the Platonic sources, but explains how we can achieve the same level of consciousness that great beings did, including Jesus. So this is how, what the Gospel of Mary Magdalene teaches, not the apocalyptic, and shows, if we talk about Jesus, not apocalyptic Jesus, not messianic Jesus, because I personally do not believe he was a Messiah, but a great teacher who was telling us, you can have my peace I give you, basically, right? Which is the most iconic kind of words taught by this particular teacher, who says, you can achieve the same peace, you can achieve the same level of consciousness, and these are the ways of doing it. Yeah, rather than being dependent on somebody, in a very kind of slave master, so to speak, way, depending on some great figure coming and saving us. So, what I'm saying now may be, difficult to accept for some people who are more, traditionally inclined, but that's why I read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and this is what basically it teaches, in my opinion. But this is what do you need to do to reach the same level of consciousness, or in Eastern terms, the same level of enlightenment as I did? What can you do so you have the peace, that I have? So my peace I give you, but my peace is also this higher level of consciousness, so you can actually comprehend and integrate the teachings that I came here to give. So my argument, for example, of traditional Christianity is, if I just stray away a little bit from this, is that traditional, and actually it's quite interesting, once a nun told me when I was in a Catholic school, that focuses, on the figure of the teacher, Jesus in this case, and on his death and resurrection, but does not focus on his teachings, when teachings actually, are the teachings of, of our own spiritual evolution, right? So we are the ones that resurrect ourselves. So what I believe the Catholic Church, for example, did, they focus, and talking about now back to Egypt, which all Egyptian esoterica is really about Osiris, Isis, and Horus, and the process of ascension of the soul, so to speak. And, the role of the Hierophant and the initiate, and that we can transcend death when we are still alive. Okay, so there's a profound esoteric teachings of ancient Egypt. And what happened, for example, with Christianity, I think, and especially of Catholicism, they took the essence of these teachings, which is, the figure of one person, this one teacher, Jesus, who, died and was resurrected. Okay, but they just focus on the ritual without understanding its meaning, and this is what the Egyptian esoterica is saying, right? So they are just like Egyptian priests, basically Catholic priests. They follow the ritual, they just repeat the ritual of a one particular person, but they do not understand the meaning behind it, and that the teachings are actually about us reaching higher levels of consciousness, and this is just a symbol. The symbol of Jesus resurrected is the symbol of what we can accomplish, by following spiritual teachings.
A couple of super chats. Brett Forsyth, thank you very much for your super chat. He says, keep up the great work. Well, thank you, Brett. The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene present in any early Christian canon?
Okay, so Christian canon, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. So Christian canon really didn't show up until the 4th century and the Council of Nicaea 325. Council of Nicaea was a really messy affair because it lasted a year. That's why sometimes there are like different dates, 323 or 324 to 325, because all bishops from Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, and Gaul were invited to participate and agree what's going into Christian canon, right? And it lasted a year because nobody could agree with anything, and half of the bishops left in anger, and what was it really about? It was about Constantine the Great, who was an emperor of Rome then, who decided that Christianity is going to become the ruling religion, and then Theodosius and so on, the ruling religion of the Roman Empire. And they wanted to make sure that the teachings that are going to be canonical teachings, which is canonical means according to the rule, Roman rule, are not something that embarrasses the empire. It's something that undermines the role of the emperor, right? So they could choose only the teachings that actually strengthen the position of the emperor, that things could be the way always been. It's just that instead of having many gods, you would have one god or maybe a trinity, right? So basically, canonical teachings started in 4th century after the Council of Nicaea, and they were the teachings that again conform with the Roman rule. And all other gospels, early gospels, and we know that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene existed already in early 200s at the latest, possibly even 990s of Common Era, and others like, for example, Gospel of Thomas, which is a very early gospel, were not accepted. And my theory is that they were not accepted because they were not conforming to the rule. They were not about royal bloods. They were not about, obeying the emperor. The famous saying from the Bible, give to emperor what is emperor's. And the Gospels that were rejected do not say anything like that. they present Jesus, and in this case also Mary Magdalene, as a carrier of his teachings, but tell us to work on ourselves independently. These are the teachings, so you have the peace and you have the level of awareness and consciousness and greatness that I have achieved, right? So to answer your question, they were not part of any canon because they were right from the beginning rejected, but they were not rejected until the 4th century, right? So the 4th century, when the Roman Empire said, now, if we are going to be Christian, this is what Christianity means, and it has to support the Roman Empire, and it has to support the role of the emperor as, representative, as a high priest also, right? Because he's representative of the religion, as he was during the Roman Empire. So the Gospels, now coined as Gnostic Gospels, that do not conform to this kind of rule, were rejected because they were basically too independent thinking, and they focus on our own, what can we do for our own spiritual growth rather than obey a Messiah or obey an emperor, or embarrass the empire, or because they are quite more from the point of view of an empire, they are very anarchistic, because who wants, if you're an emperor, do you want a free thinking citizen? No, you don't, right? Because then why would anybody, respect royalty or, an emperor if you don't believe that he's divine or better than you, right? If it is all about spiritual attainment, what is a spiritual attainment of an emperor? Maybe Marcus Aurelius maybe had some spiritual attainment because he was a great philosopher. I give it to him. But the majority of them were warriors, or some of them were complete degenerates, right? So, so no, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was never included in early canon, because like other Gospels that do not conform to the Roman rule, they were basically not included in the Gospel during the Council of Nicaea in 325.
Does this text in any way help shed even a small amount of light on what Mary Magdalene taught, if she taught anything at all, to continue to spread Jesus' teachings after the death of Jesus?
Yes, so that's a fantastic question. And yes, this is the second part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Just let me open my Gospel here of Mary Magdalene. So in case I have to quote, so just don't want to give you wrong information if I refer to the pages. So, for example, on page 10, and this is what I call the second part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because the first part of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's Peter asking Jesus questions, and Jesus gives the surprisingly, rebellious answers. You're not sinful. Just if you act from the lower consciousness, then the consequences of your actions will be bad for you, right? Or no, we don't need more laws. So imagine now, back to the question, right, that we just discussed. Imagine, Roman Empire who wants obedient, citizens, and it says, and why would he accept the gospel in which Jesus teaches, we don't need more rules. We need more freedom, because then you can explore things, right? So otherwise we're bound by too many rules. So of course, this was like, from an imperial point of view, we don't want that, right? And also, do not let others to mislead you by telling you that the truth is outside you. Like, the emperor or the priest will tell you, what's right. Look within, find the peace that I have given you. You look at, the best in yourself, and then the truth lies there. It's not out there. So this is already very dangerous from an imperial point of view. And on page 10, this is Peter said to Mary, I'm quoting, "Sister, we know the teacher loved you differently than he loved other women. Tell us whatever you remember of any words he told you, which we have not heard." And she says, I will tell you what he told me, right? And she says, in a vision, right? So it's quite interesting. And then she says that, okay, so I'm not going to. She said that she saw him in a vision, and he said, you're blessed because you're not afraid, although you see me in the nous. And this is where we come to this, complex concept of nous, nous, which is translated sometimes as a heart, but it's usually only in Professor King's interpretation. But generally, nous means a hook between lower and higher consciousness, between human and divine consciousness. So this is an ability to reach out for divine consciousness or cosmic consciousness or Christ consciousness, for Christians and so on, right? So he says, you're blessed because you can see me in the nous and you are not afraid of seeing me. And she says, then she asks him exactly what's nous, and he tells her exactly that this is, it's a space which is, she says, is it in psyche, which is psyche in English, or is it pneuma or pneuma? So psyche is a, intellectual and emotional life, and pneuma or pneuma in Greek is divine consciousness. And he says, no, it is in between these two. This is the hook that, allows you to connect divine and human consciousness. So, and then he gives her the teachings. Okay. So in this respect, she is not, she doesn't have her own teachings. She basically repeats what the teacher told her when she met him in the space where the divine consciousness and human consciousness meet, right? So which is called Venus. And then the teachings of the ascension of the soul start. However, page 11 to 14 are missing again, so we have to work around it. And on page 15, we talk about ascension of the soul. So we don't know what is the first level of ascension of the soul that is discussed in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because these pages are missing. However, if we overlap it with Egyptian teachings or with Platonic teachings, which say similar things, the first stage would be called the stage of soma. So soma is wrong identification. It's interestingly that George Orwell in 1984, when he was talking about people getting basically brainwashed, that they were drinking soma, right? So soma is wrong identification. What does it mean? So the first level of understanding, which is really very lowest level of understanding, and unfortunately, perhaps the majority of humanity is brainwashed to this level of understanding, because I think we have infinite potentials as spiritual individuals, is the belief that there's only material reality. So soma is the belief only in the material reality. So, for example, we have no concept of, surviving, for example, death. We have no concept of soul, or maybe we have a concept, we've heard about the concept of the soul, but we do not really believe it, right? So that's why, for example, the fear of death comes from this. Or, for example, what's going on, the artificial intelligence nowadays, when people are wanting to prolong life through, artificial means, it is because you believe that there is only material world. So the first level of consciousness as the soul travels is the level of soma, which means there is only belief in the material. And I would say that most of the Western civilization nowadays probably, is brainwashed to this, right? We are not stupid. We're just basically brainwashed into this, that everything is just a material level. So anything else, that's why he says, you are blessed because you see me in the nous and you understand that it is real, right? Because anything that is beyond like three-dimensional material being is considered completely irrelevant. And this is what also Carl Jung was saying when he was saying, that how can you talk about spiritual experience? And I write academically about spiritual experience, because they ask you to prove something that is beyond these three dimensions of materiality within these three dimensions. So how can you explain it? Like if you show a painting to a blind person, they will say it doesn't exist, right? So this is this very basic level of reality, which is level 1. Now, level 2 is called psyche or psyche. So it's quite interesting because in psyche is a Platonic concept, right? And psyche, it is where all emotions and desires, which in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it's called cravings. It's cravings and desires are stored. Okay. So, for example, and in Egyptian, so this is Neoplatonic. In Egyptian, it is called, quite interestingly, Osiris's spine. And there are paintings engravings of Osiris's spine showing actually 4 levels, like in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So Osiris's spine, or psyche, basically stores emotions in human emotions, human individual emotions. So, for example, if an individual dies, his or her desires, or fulfilled or especially unfulfilled desires and cravings, stay, and which means they are stored somewhere. So the body dies, but the desires do not die in Egyptian esoterica. And quite interestingly, in Hinduism, the same. They're called vasanas, which means basically this unfulfilled cravings. So they stay. The body dies, but unfulfilled cravings stay. So when I was reading Jean-Yves Leloup's Neoplatonic interpretation of the Gospel, he says they are immortal but not eternal. So it means they are not eternal because they are not divine, but it means that they're immortal because they are going to carry from lifetime to lifetime, if you believe in reincarnation, until they are fulfilled and then they die. Okay, so this is the second level of consciousness, which, the belief and the possibility that our desires and tendencies are stored, in some kind of psychological body, and then they move on, right? And this Osiris spine in Egyptian esoterica is also called diet, right? So this is when our desires are stored. And then in esoteric Tantra, for example, in esoteric Hinduism, it's called Sushumna, which is basically this kind of tunnel in our esoteric body where our desires are being stored. So this is psyche. So this, for example, in Egypt or in Hinduism, forces us to reincarnate, so to speak. Because if you have unfulfilled desire, for example, you want to be a big podcaster, or I wanted, when I was young, I wanted to be a famous writer. You want to be a professor. You want to be a rich person, and so on. This kind of holds you into the Earth's domain, three-dimensional experience, so to speak, because you want to have this experience so much that you cannot move on to a higher level of consciousness. Does it make sense? Because I don't want to make it too complicated. So if we desire something really strongly and our desire is not fulfilled, it holds us back in our spiritual evolution. That's why in esoterica, it is very often, they tell you 2 things when I had a teacher, spiritual teacher. If you strongly desire something, either, if you can, let go of this desire, so you are freed. But sometimes very difficult. I know from experience, I'm this kind of person. It's very difficult for me to give up my desires spiritually. Or they say, go for it. Fulfill this desire. Because once you fulfill this desire, you, will free yourself from this and you will not need it anymore. And sometimes the consequences of this desire, fulfillment of this desire, may be negative or not what you have expected, but that's also good because it frees your soul from this being hooked to the earthly domain, so to speak, of 3 dimensions, because you think like money will bring you happiness, or fame will bring you happiness, or whatever, a title will bring you happiness, and then you learn it actually doesn't. So either way, you have to free yourself, either by basically experiencing it and being prepared for unsuspected consequences of the fulfillment of this desire, which may be negative, or if you can spiritually overcome this desire. So this is the second level, and it's called Osiris' spine, or diet, or Sushumna and Vasanas in esoteric Hinduism, or psyche or psyche in Neoplatonism. And level 3 is actually nous. Yes, so it's nous. So the level 3 deals with either ignorance or wisdom, because each level has a higher potential and a lower possibility, right? So nous as a higher potential is this openness to a higher wisdom. And this is what Mary Magdalene is doing in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, because she uses her nous, her openness and her desire for a higher wisdom to connect with Jesus's teachings, right? Which is, or, higher teachings, but in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Jesus's teachings. When in the lower expression of level 3 of then you're ignorant, which means you refuse higher knowledge. You refuse higher knowledge because you caught up either in level 1, which means there is no higher knowledge. We are just bags of meat, right? And we die, and that's it. Worms eat us, unless we use like artificial intelligence or something to prolong our lives. In level 2, we have such strong desires that maybe we know about higher knowledge, but our desires are too strong to reach out for this. All right. So level 3 as nous has also an esoteric Egyptian name, which is Sekhem. And interesting, Sekhem means power of the gods or life force. Okay, so power of the gods. So it means like if you open your nous, if you open for divine wisdom, you reach the power of the gods. And Sekhem also is often translated through Latin as a scepter, which is, held by, for example, the Pope or by the royalty, and also the crown, and is actually a parody of Ankh, of Egyptian Ankh, right, which shows the tree of life and tree of wisdom and the serpent, and the crown, right? So the crown, and it's interesting because the nous is supposed to be above the head, right? So it is like the crown, which is, and all crowns are of the same level. So basically the ability is a symbol of ability to reach out for higher wisdom. So it's either, you reach out for higher wisdom, or your desires, because of your psyche, of your stored desires and cravings are so strong that you choose not to do it. So if you don't mind, I'll just give you personal example, so it's not so abstract. So for example, when I went for initiation, for spiritual initiation, it was an extremely powerful, almost too powerful experience for me. So my ego couldn't hold it, basically, right? And I felt I was falling apart, and but I have these visions, of cosmic consciousness, and I was actually I was perceiving is energy, so I should have felt blessed. But guess what my first question was? I was just finishing my PhD, and I was thinking, but what about my PhD? So this was an example of lower consciousness interfering in the process of ascension of consciousness. Because here I was giving, a vision of a universe, so to speak, but my concern was, I am a person that finishes everything, so it's like ego clicks in. And, I'm just at the end of my PhD. What about my PhD? Instead of like, let's say, merging with divine consciousness, I actually brought myself back. Does it make sense? So in a way, I could say that at this time, I basically gave in. I was giving the glory of his divine vision, but I descend into ignorance. But it was so powerful in my experience that the rituals had to be performed on me as an initiate, so I actually wouldn't dissolve, because like my psyche couldn't deal with what was going on. So at the end, I did choose, by doing what I'm doing here with with your friends, pursue the divine knowledge and expansion of consciousness. But in the moment when it was given to me, my lower level of consciousness actually brought me down, right? When I just to give a modern example, for example, when great sages like Ramana Maharshi in India, or for example, like, I don't know what you think about Eckhart Tolle, but I think he's genuine. They just gave into this example. They just merge with divine consciousness, especially Ramana Maharshi, When I was given it, and I just thought, I have to finish my PhD, sorry. That's descent into ignorance. So, I take responsibility for this. But it's interesting that the level 3, which is Sekhem in esoteric, Egyptian esoterica, is called as life force or the power of the gods, which means, and if I can just digress, because I was discussing it, I'm sorry, it's wrong, camera is on the wrong side. In the other goddess, Tantra teachers of esoteric Tantra teach. You know, you will be walking like gods and goddesses on earth, right? Because you're open to Venus, expansion of consciousness. But you have to first give yourself permission, you know, to open up to the divine consciousness. And you have to believe it is possible for you, right? So the message is the same. It's the power of the gods, and in esoteric Tantra, you'll be walking like gods and goddesses on earth, and life force. So if you don't mind me digressing again to esoteric Tantra, life force is also Kundalini energy, which is moving through the body. And I discuss this experience, you know, of awakening in my book. And, you know, and also Western philosophers such as Henri Bergson, who died in 1943 in France, you know, was talking about élan vital, the life force, and with human consciousness, which is amazing that the, you know, Western philosopher, he was a great, great mind, much bigger than, you know, Kant or, you know, Descartes, in my opinion, actually arrived at this conclusion himself, you know, that élan vital is the life force, the force of the God, so to speak, is the one that lives in a human consciousness and that needs to be explored. So it's level 3. Now, level 4 is pneuma or pneuma, right? Depends if you pronounce it in Greek or pronounce it in English. And it is basically the level of cosmic consciousness or divine consciousness, so where the great beings, you know, Jesus, for example, was there, right? Or I assume any great being of Abrahamic religions or, you know, Western, Eastern religions like Buddha, you know, for example, experience. So this is when you completely merge with divine consciousness, because nothing holds you back. You know that it's not only level 1, which is soma, just the material world. Your unfulfilled desires from level 2, which is psyche or psyche, do not hold you. In level 3, you open your nous to divine consciousness, and it didn't let it to pull you down the way I did originally, right? And now you merge with divine consciousness, and this is what great teachers such as, for example, Jesus, the way I see him, or, you know, the Buddha, or anybody that is considered, you know, a great messiah, or, you know, head of a great spiritual movement, you know, achieved, right? However, this level is also called the wrath. So, you know, the wrath, like the extreme anger. So this is quite interesting, because to reach this level, you have one last obstacle, Mary Magdalene says, that this is what she believes Jesus had taught her. To reach pneuma, what you have to overcome is the wrath of your own ego. I'm using modern terminology, right? Freudian terminology, ego, or the wrath of your own self-doubt and the wrath of the world. Because all great beings, and I guess like Jesus is a perfect example, right? Look what, you know, happened to him, right? Will encounter the resistance of a three-dimensional world, which is soma. Right, so the wrath of the ego, or which is called also self-doubt, to reach pneuma or pneuma, is basically own self-doubt saying, who do you think you are? So do you think you deserve of this? So in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, she says, who do you think you are, murderer? The ego asks the soul. Who do you think you are, murderer? Why murderer? Because you're murdering, you're killing your lower self. Right? Because by not physically, but by transcending it. And this is what, you know, in all spiritual traditions, esoteric tradition, is the death of the ego, you know, when you become like a god, basically, right? Merge with divine consciousness. So the ego asks the soul, who do you think you are, murderer? Or where do you think you're going, vagabond? Right? It's a very poetic way. Where do you think you're going? You're nothing without me, which is basically the last kind of scream of the ego, right? Of the lower consciousness, level 1 or 2 especially, right? Like you dissolve in nothingness, you know, there is no divine consciousness, right? And the answer of the soul, which I think is really interesting for anybody who also watched the film Matrix, it is, I left the design, which I think like Matrix, I left the design with the help of the higher design. And I think it's a very kind of cryptic, and I really love it. I led the design, like the matrix, the three-dimensional matrix, with the help of the higher design. So she basically points us towards higher reality, which is pneuma or pneuma, and that we can reach this reality through the use of our nous, which is our ability to reach out for divine consciousness, which I believe it's a birthright, because all spiritual esoteric traditions talk about it, you are your own savior, this energy lives within you, and you'll be walking like gods and goddesses on earth. And you transcended your psyche or psyche, which is your cravings and desires, which basically bound us to the three-dimensional world. And of course, you transcended your attachment to the material world, especially to your own body. So in a nutshell, hope I didn't overcomplicate it. My purpose was to simplify it, actually. These are the teachings of Mary Magdalene, which in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, she says Jesus had given her when she met him in the nous, when she opened to his divine consciousness and his divine wisdom.
And in my closing question, what led you to the conclusion that Mary Magdalene and Mary the Prophetess are the same person?
Well, this is this is my opinion based on research. So I discussed it in my book, Via the Goddess, because what really struck me, for example, is, first of all, I try to retract how I reached this conclusion. So first I was reading Vita Contemplativa by Philo of Alexandria, a great Jewish Platonic philosopher who lived, mid-century, first century in Alexandria. And then he said that there was a group of prophets, philosophers, spiritual healers, and spiritual teachers who were quite independently thinking, who called Prophetess, who allowed women in the circles. And I was interested then, in women philosophers at the time, and, in Mary Magdalene. And I thought that's very interesting. He also mentioned that they were connected with the temple of Isis, and I connected as an archetype, Mary Magdalene with the archetype of Isis, the priestess that is very erotic and at the same time responsible for or necessary for the process of resurrection. And then he says that they were well known for having friends in some circles in the Galilee, and also with the Essenes in the Holy Land, what I call Holy Land, right? But in Judea and Galilee and so on. So I thought, oh, that's very interesting, because, there was a bunch of thinkers who were healers, who are interested in the ascension of the soul, that were somehow connected with the esoteric teachings of Egypt, because Isis is considered a hierophant that helps the initiates, and they also, had connections with Jewish teachers in the Galilee and so on. So I thought that's very interesting, and I thought, because I was looking at the traditions of Mary Magdalene, and there's this very strong European tradition that she, after the resurrection, she went to, or after the crucifixion, she went to France. There's another tradition that says she went to Greece, right? And I said, well, if I were Mary Magdalene, right, I wouldn't go to any of these places. I would go to the place that actually welcomes me, I welcomes a woman who is spiritually gifted, and this is what Prophetess would did. They welcome women who are spiritually and philosophically gifted. So I thought, well, let's check. So just sharing my thinking process from my book. So let's check when there was a woman in Alexandria that could fulfill this kind of definition, that is close to Mary Magdalene. And then, I found Mary the Jewess, or Mary the Prophetess, or Mary the Alchemist, who was a real historical figure, and who, unlike other alchemists, she was teaching a spiritual alchemy, which is the theory of ascension of consciousness. I thought that's very interesting, because this is what the Gospel of Mary Magdalene actually teaches. And the reason why we really know about Mary the Prophetess, who we know was Jewish or half Jewish, and some esoteric Christian sources also say that Mary Magdalene was a Jewish Egyptian hybrid, was another alchemist from the historical figure, also historical figure called Zosimus of Panapolis, and a Panapolis is Akhmin nowadays. And he says that Mary, the prophetess, you know, is his like spiritual predecessor, and this is what she was doing, that I just explained. And I thought that it was very interesting that Panapolis, which is Akhmin nowadays, is the place in which the actual Gospel of Mary Magdalene was fought. So I know that there are kind of tenuous connections, but it is quite interesting that an alchemist who specializes in ascension of the soul lived in Alexandria in the 1st century, and that in the 1st century Alexandria was a circle of people who of philosophers and spiritual healers are interested in the ascension of the soul, who had contacts, who accepted women and had the contacts with the, you know, teachers, the Essenes and other teachers in the Holy Land. And that the man who mentions this woman, you know, who was his kind of predecessor, is actually from Akhmin, which is the place that the first fragment of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was found. So this is basically a question that I'm asking people who are, you know, obsessed with the French tradition or Greek tradition of Mary Magdalene. I said, doesn't it perhaps make more sense that she actually went to Egypt and that she was Mary the Jewess, you know, or Mary the alchemist, or Mary the prophetess, which kind of again emphasizes her spiritual gifts, who lived in Alexandria, especially that there was a place for her that would welcome her, and that her gospel was found in the city in which the man who mentions her as the main alchemist, spiritual alchemist of the 1st century, is the same place in which her gospel was found, which suggests that there was already tradition of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene there. So this is my question, you know, and this is my thinking process, how I arrived at this conclusion.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Joanna Kujawa.
I hope it wasn't too complicated.
Oh,
so,
no,
thank you
I
so
thought
much.
it was great. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you
thanks
for
so
joining me.
much. I really appreciate, you know, your time and everybody who joined us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate you for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.